Good evening, honorable members and guests. Please note that we will resume at 18:30. This is to afford some time to those members who had attended their house physically to travel to their respective residences and connect. So we will resume at 6:30, honorable members.
Evening.
Evening, Chair.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, Chair.
I'm just trying to check with you if we have got the required number to kickstart whilst following up with the other members.
Yes, Chairperson, we do have the required number to start. Thank you, Chair.
So you'd want to check on the background with the other members. In particular, Honorable Kubeka and Honorable Machozi.
Yes, Chair, I'm busy with that, Chair.
I do know that Honorable Kubeka was also physically in the house. We can start at 18:35, just 3 minutes. Good evening, honorable members, our guests in the platform, fellow South Africans who are following deliberations of this subcommittee in different platforms. I understand that we do have adequate numbers to proceed, and that we would want to indeed proceed from 18:35 if we get confirmation that the candidate is also admitted to come through, so that we then start in earnest.
Yes, Chairperson, good evening, and good evening to honorable members and guests. Chairperson, Mr. Luisiko is on the platform. He's just trying. He is. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, Mr. Siko.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Evening. As I said, you are welcomed. This is a subcommittee of the Committee on Communications, created in terms of the National Assembly rules, which provide that a committee could put up a subcommittee that focuses on a particular task. And the task for this subcommittee is that of ensuring the filling in of the vacancies that have occurred in the MDDA, as you would have been duly nominated, shortlisted to come before the subcommittee. And the subcommittee is, of course, constituted by different political parties as they are represented in Parliament, of course, taking into account the electoral support that they would have received in the recent national and provincial elections. Just to deal with the formalities, just to indicate that in the way we approach this discussion, and I'm saying discussion because we take it as a conversation that we're having with you, and that through that engagement, we can learn from you as a candidate beyond the interview, as well that you can learn from the interactions that members would have. So our approach to it really is such that I will briefly introduce the members, starting of course with the members of the ANC who are present on the platform, and then go to the other parties. Immediately after that, I will then give you 5 minutes to briefly introduce yourself as you reflect also to your academic and the experiences that you have, and why that would then contribute to the MDDA in a situation where you were to be considered. We do that taking into account that members would have had access to your detailed CV well in advance, and therefore in them engaging with you, they'll probably go beyond that you would have said in your brief introduction, because they would have had an opportunity of looking through your CV. So it's a total engagement in that scope. After that, we'll then give each of the members that's on the platform 5 minutes. In the 5 minutes, it will be their questions as well as your responses within the 5 minutes allocated per member. Once the last member would have interacted with you, I will, of course, come in case there is a point that one needs to lift up. Otherwise, I do not really get to that engagement of questions as I facilitate the discussion. So in that score, as I go to the members to introduce them, I want you to once again feel welcomed, relax, just take it as an opportunity to have a conversation with members of Parliament, and we'll be listening to you attentively. I think that's important, especially in the evening. That's the time for us to be relaxing. That use that to relax, but have a conversation with members of Parliament. Please feel welcome, Mr. In that score, I'll start by introducing the members of the ANC, starting with Honorable Kubeka.
Evening, Chair.
That's Honorable Kubeka. Mr. Sip, I'm sure you can see her.
Yes, I can.
Yes. We then have the Honorable Faku. Honorable Faku.
Evening, Chair. Hello.
Good evening,
Honorable Faku. We then have the Honorable Kumbo. Honorable Kumbo.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I'm here.
Okay, that's Honorable Kumbo. Thank you, Honorable Kumbo. Then myself, also from the ANC, Honorable Manili, but I'm also sharing the session, as I said. I will now move quickly to the Democratic Alliance. Honorable Mbele. I hope to see Honorable Mbele. Honorable Kumbo, if you can switch your video off for now, so that
I'm trying something.
Thank you. In that score, I'm also just going to mention, for purposes of formality, that we also have representation in this subcommittee from the IFP, Honorable Machozi, who has not been able to connect at this point. We also have Honorable Pambo from the EFF, who's also not on the platform as yet. However, for purpose of record, I want to state that the numbers that we have do allow us to proceed with the interviews.
Recording in progress.
To us by parliament arrangements in terms of the number to correct and proceed with our task. So with that, as I said, it's now gonna be an opportunity for you as we start counting your 5 minutes to briefly introduce yourself, as well as I said, reflecting on your experiences and academic development that you've undergone in a way that also demonstrate how that would assist if you were to be considered for MDDA. Over to you, Mr. Sko.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, honorable members. My name is Louis Itumeleng Siecho, born and bred in Alexandra Township. Went to multiple schools there. Also got an opportunity on a scholarship to go and study at St. John's College in Johannesburg. Went to Wits, did my diploma in marketing with the Institute of Marketing, did an MBA degree with the University of Liverpool. I've been in the marketing industry for over 20 years now. I started my advertising agency in 1998 when I realized that the messaging and the images that were being fed ignored the languages and cultures of our people. And as a brand manager at Johnson & Johnson, I always had a lot of arguments with advertising agencies who were giving me ideas, which I realized these ideas are not speaking to the majority of our people. So I thought, instead of howling and making noise, and by the way, we presented to Parliament on a number of occasions, in how we can transform the media industry. In 2003, I took a journey traveling the whole country for 18 months, living in different homes with new people, strangers, just to get a sense of what makes this human being a consumer. It soon became very clear that you can't live with people and just see them as consumers. They are human beings first and foremost. So I came out of that trip with a lot of knowledge on the different cultures of the people who live in this country. And as a result, I then wrote a book called Marketing the Same Difference. You can see a copy of the book here. A lot of research which I've shared with the industry, which has shaped in many ways the sense the industry now has that if you want to speak to people in a way that goes to their hearts, as our indomitable President Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela said, you need to speak to them with their language, and then your message will go to their hearts, and it also will get into their minds. The issue of media transformation is something that we've been dealing with for many, many, many years. And when the MDDA came into being in 2003. We celebrated because we believed now here was an organization that was going to help us to transform this industry. I have a deep sense of what I think needs to happen with the industry. I'm willing to share my knowledge, my skills in driving the MDDA to be what it can be. I'm very, very encouraged that a lot of work has been done by the MDDA. And as a result, people like me are able to speak as an authority in the industry. There are many of my colleagues in the industry, some of them own radio stations, they own television stations. I think it is an opportune time to take the MDDA to another level and ensure that it can get this transformation message moving on in a very strong way, in a way that continues to empower our people. I'm very happy that we have more than 200 community radio stations. That is very, very, very powerful. I mean, big ups can go to the members of parliament who work very hard to fund the MDDA to ensure that we can get to a situation that we have. Community radio is very vibrant. Television is vibrant in our communities. What we need to do as a leadership in the media sector is to provide support, advertising spend, so that they can rely less on government, support to position themselves in a way that brands would want to be part of those communities. I mean, it is really exciting times. I'm happy to be here. I hope that gives a good introduction of who I am. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Siecho. I would now, without waste of time, having done your introduction, then get the members to interact with you. Of course, the interaction will be in the following order. I'll take Honorable Faku, followed by Honorable Mbele, who will then be followed by Honorable Kumbu, and Honorable Kobeka would be last before I get in. So that would be the order at this point. Honorable Faku, I recognize you.
I'll use my phone as a stopwatch so that I know where I am in terms of the time you've given me. So if I look down, don't think I'm being naughty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sesho. That also assists that we're together in this. So we have already started the conversation. Honorable Faku, I recognize you can proceed.
Thank you very much, Chair. Greetings again to yourself and to honorable members. Greeting, Mr. Can you pronounce your surname for me? Sorry.
Siecho.
Siecho, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your opening remarks. Interesting indeed. I hear that you've been going around doing research, going to homes in the past, and you've shown us your book, and we are indeed grateful. Hopefully, we can get copies, Chair, of the book. But mainly, MDDA currently is struggling when it comes to research. It's one of its KPI that they have not achieved in the last quarter. They've been struggling for quite some time. As you know, that there are constraints of budget. And so I want to check, if given an opportunity, what can you do to make sure that research, this target is met? And secondly, I'm happy also when I look at your CV, marketing, MDDA. Currently, you know, we fund these community radio stations through MDDA, but at the end of the day, they are not sustainable. And I've listened to you when you were doing your opening remarks, you were saying that there are lots of ideas that you have. Can you please share with us these ideas that you have? Because remember, some of them get not much, I think about 45,000 rand or more because of the constraint of budget. And how can you, maybe which other ways do you think MDDA can be sustainable on its own? Because remember, government is giving them a very limited budget, but they have a huge responsibility. My last point is the issue of transformation. Fully agree with you with what you are saying, that the sector is not totally transformed. What will you make so that even a child, my own child, has access to these community radios? And you know, the issue of languages, we've been speaking about it. So I want to hear more about that. I especially opening remarks, I think you touched on very important issues. So I'm giving you that opportunity now to talk to us so that we can listen. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, ma'am. You know, what is very clear is that government doesn't have money to spend in what others might define as non-essentials. Government is stretched, the needs of our citizens is greater. So for any move or plan that seeks to ask for more money from government is a plan that is not going to be helpful. What the MDDA has together with its community radio station is the power of content. And it is the power of the people that listen to these radio stations. What we need to be able to do is to bring all skills together to harness the content that these community radio stations have. And the listenership, because in our industry, we pay for listenership. We're not paying for the whistles and the bells. We're paying for the ability to reach people. What community radio stations need to do is to prove that the people that they are reaching, they understand them. They know why they are buying the products that they do. They should know where they are buying. They should know what languages they speak. They should know their numbers. And if they take that information and put it together in a marketing way and share that information with brands and industry players, it shouldn't be difficult to get funding or advertising spend flowing in the direction of community radio stations. What I found them to be a problem is the fact that all of them want to operate as silos. I think there's an opportunity to bring them together, because together in their numbers, they can provide greater value to the industry. And if they can create a greater value to the industry, then they can charge a decent fee for the audiences that they are bringing to brands. I mean, collectively, they've got great numbers and they've got the content. They have a better understanding of the communities than actually commercial radio stations do, because they live amongst the people. But what they need to do is to take that information and package it in a way that is understood by the industry, so that the industry can see the value of what community radio stations are about. They must not spend time trying to sound like these popular presenters on TV or radio. They must be true to who they are, you know, and often they are struggling and making great attempts to sound like Azania Musaka on 702, instead of sounding like a type of presenter that the community where they come from appreciates. In fact, in my trips across the country, I've spent a lot of time at these radio stations to get an understanding of how they operate. So I'm saying, because they've got the numbers of people, that they've got the content, they've got value, and that value can be sold to agencies without any complication. In terms of transformation, I believe that transformation is something that the MDA must continue to drive. But what is very, very important is that we must bring partners in the industry into the MDDA to work with the MDDA. As I said earlier, we've got people who have benefited from the transformation and the work that the MDDA has done. People who own radio stations. These are the people we need to bring around the table and say, part of what informed the starting of the MDDA was to partner with print organizations and media companies to drive transformation. So we need to go back to industry and say, you agreed that you will partner government in creating diversity and development in the media industry. What have you done? What can we do together? I think that the days of government throwing money at the MDDA must come to an end. We have patrons in the industry who are benefiting from this industry, who are benefiting from their relationship with citizens. They must begin to put money in the MDDA. In fact, we must commit them to keep the MDDA alive and functioning, but they must play a role in how the MDDA must do its work to benefit the industry. I mean, I'll give you an example of the Unilever Institute of Strategic Marketing at UCT. It was funded by the Unilever for many, many years, and they funded research. That institute became relevant because on a quarterly basis, yearly basis, it presented information about people and how brands can interact with these people. When Unilever left the institute, Liberty Life came on board. They are supporting the institute. I don't see why the MDDA cannot be a driver of content, of relevant information, of explaining to industry or educating industry who are these people, where do they live, why do they eat what they eat, and how you must communicate with them. And for that, brands, because they want to sell more, they should be able to pay for that type of information. I must caution, legislation is not the way to go. You know, often when we speak to government, we say legislate. We are more than 25 years into this democracy. And we've seen how far can legislation go. We need to bring in the players around the table so that we can get the MDDA to what it should do, and so that we can have more transformation, we can have more access for our people in the media space. Thank you. And by the way, ma'am, just
can I be heard now?
It's not complicated. What I'm suggesting, if you take into consideration that when Alex FM was looted and burned down during the riots, 2 million came from the NLC to resuscitate Alex FM. Prime Media gave 50,000 rand, and the CEO of Prime Media challenged all other CEOs of media companies to come on board and fund that station. And that station is operational today with more money than they've had before. So I think we have people in the industry who can help take the MDDA to another level. I thank you.
Can I be heard now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I've been trying to speak through my mic to manage the time.
Okay, sorry about that, sorry.
And thanks, Honorable Faku, for the questions asked and the responses received. I now call Honorable Mbele. You are now recognized. You can then proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and good evening to you, Mr. Siecho. Thank you very much for availing yourself for this engagement as part of the interview and selection process. I must say, I really resonated quite strongly with all of the points you were touching on in your opening remarks, as well as the responses to Honorable Faku, because they speak exactly to my core passion when it comes to the MDDA, which is how do we build and ensure its sustainability going into the future. And even just glancing at your CV, you know, just all the sort of key topics around sustainability, profitability, pitch formulation and presentation, brand building, and what you were saying about creating value and marketing, and it all just speaks exactly to what I think the MDDA needs as its foundation and springboard going into the future. So I'd really like to, for my 5 minutes window, to be given over to you as much as possible to continue unpacking and expanding on your ideas around that. I want to say my questions, and you've partly answered them, but you're welcome to speak further if you have any other points to touch on. Let me just find my notes here very quickly. So my first question is to ask, from a perspective of what I've been calling strategic gap identification, what would you say is a key shortfall in the MDDA currently, especially from a governance outlook and through a high-level strategic lens? I heard you say something about the deficiencies, or rather the predominance of silo approaches, which I think sort of leans in that direction, but I don't want to lead you in your answer. Just what you would identify as that strategic gap. And then I'd really like you to please expand further around the unique value add that you believe you have to contribute to the MDDA. As I said, your CV kind of speaks for itself, but just to kind of unpack that further, skills, networks, and how you see yourself contributing to building that sustainability of the MDDA, in particular when it comes to cultivating partnerships, networks, resource mobilization, and how we can really kind of level up the community media sector, because I do agree with you that there's lots of potential and latent value there. It just needs to be linked to where the money and where the resources are through clever networking and partnership building. Thank you, Chair. That's all from me.
Thank you, Honorable Mbele. I'm going to give you an interesting example. We, as industry players within the advertising agency, exist in an environment where it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to relate to the SABC in terms of buying media. And unfortunately, what that does, we take money that we get from government as a client, we're spending it in areas like digital media and other platforms that are more embracing, that are more willing to partner with us in business relationships. And whilst you find that most Black agencies are battling to have an account with the SABC. Therefore, without an account with the SABC, they cannot buy media from the SABC. They take government money from the tenders that they get, and that money is not spent in areas where it should be empowering our people, in the sense of how many people listen to SABC radio products. Because of these stringent credit systems that they have, which are archaic, because they don't take into consideration the economic dynamics of the new entrants in the industry. The SABC is not benefiting from our participation in buying media. And my view is that if an agency has got a PO from government, or has got a contract from government, it must give that organization an automatic credit facility at the SABC, so that we're able to use the SABC to drive our media spend, so that the SABC has got the money to drive the digital penetration strategy. It is a huge indictment, and as a result, it is white agencies with big bank balances and huge collateral from family businesses that are able to qualify for credit facilities at the SABC. I think it is very, 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 very sad. It is the same media owners who should be funding and being patrons to the MDDA. So if I get the opportunity to work with the MDDA, I would ensure that anybody that gets a contract from government gets automatic credit facilities at the SABC, so that the money that comes from government is used through the SABC to reach our people. In that way, the money circulates within what transformed this industry. I'm not sure what type of people get appointed to run these organizations that should be helping transformation and ensuring that we can get the agenda of why an organization like the MDDA was set up. Honorable Mbele, you asked me what value would I bring. That's exactly what I would drive. I would drive for change in that space. I mean, airtime. Airtime is something that you cannot save for tomorrow. If you don't use that airtime today, you've lost it today. I don't see why is it such a big risk and not to allow a black media company to buy space at the SABC without all these stringent rules that do not give black people a chance to be real players. I think the SABC could be making more money than they do today. In fact, the SABC does not need a state funding because they have the resources and the facilities that should make them generate income. And in fact, they used to do in the past. I'm sorry if I get carried away on this one. It's an opportunity that I would never have missed. And my apologies if I would have rubbed other people the wrong way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Siecho. This is the conversation we are having. And I see that you're maximizing the airtime. As I move to Honorable Kumbo. Honorable Kumbo, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Chair.
Please proceed to recognize.
Thank you, Chairperson. And good evening to Mr. Siecho. Did I?
Correct.
That Mr. Siecho?
Thank you. Yes, it is. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Just two quick questions for you from me. What will be the role of the MDDA in promoting community media in a digital environment? That will be the first one. Just want to get your understanding on that. And then the second one, what will be the role of the MDDA in corporate governance? If you can just respond to those two questions.
Thank you. I think the issue of digital media is something that we can't avoid. We are entering, actually we are in the digital space. The fourth industrial revolution is with us. What is going to be an easy task for community radio stations is the fact that they've got the content, they've got the audience, taking that content and put it in a digital format and assisting them to understand the social media space and how broad and wide the digital environment is. Shouldn't be difficult. In fact, I would hasten to even say, I think the young people who run these radio stations are more digital savvy than I am. So I would find it difficult to teach them because they probably know more about that digital environment than I do. But it would be for us to give them an enabling environment so that they can thrive in that space because they understand it better. So it shouldn't be very complicated to digitize in that environment. As when it comes to the MDDA and corporate governance, I think what is fantastic is that the MDDA has got many areas of legislation that it can rely on. It's the Act itself, it's the Public Finance Management Act, it is the Labor Act, the BBBE Act. I think there's enough legislation. That's why I'm wary of looking to legislation to deal with societal problems, especially in the media space. There's ample legislation that the MDDA should constantly focus at to ensure that it has the guideline and the policies that drives what it does, and it follows the law to the T. I am told, and even when I read, that they always get good reports from the Auditor General. So it shouldn't be complicated to keep that image of the MDDA moving forward, but there is an opportunity to reposition, repurpose, create an environment where the MDDA can give more value to our citizens and to the media industry. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Honorable Kumbu. I will now move to the Honorable Kubeka.
Thank you, Chair. Also, thank you to Mtda Itumeleng CH. And I'm impressed as I can hear, as you are presenting to ourselves, actually, that who you are. But let me start here. As you were saying, on the side of the industry, it seems as if it's a little bit difficult on the side of the MDDA to attract actually on that side in order that they can be assisted, as we know that on the side of the budget of MDDA, they are having limited resources, but also as they are receiving that clean audit for those 3 successful years, it's true to say we are expecting them to continue doing that. But at the end of the day, also, it must not be about the issue of a clean audit. Also, we want the community to benefit actually on the side of the MDDA. So can I ask you to say also on the side of the policies, as we were saying, it is not also the way to go on the side of the legislation. Do you think that the policies of MDDA and those legislation and legislative that are there are still relevant for MDDA? And also, can I just understand to say, on the side of the model of MDDA, do you think that it's also relevant in order to just to find the way of increasing on their side on the issue of their budget? Because as we are raising to say, they are getting just a limited budget, but at the end of the day, knowing that there is this distributional signal that they need also to be paid to the side of the Centec. At the end of the day, you'll see that after that, it's a little bit challenge on the side of the MDDA. What are the best methods that they can use in order to achieve, especially on the side of the model of MDDA, in order that MDDA must resuscitate itself without even thinking on the issue of asking to go and being bailed out maybe on the side of the National Treasury? Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Kubeka. I think I also need to be very careful not to express myself in a way that might be too overzealous. My starting point with the MDDA would be to go on an industry roadshow to ensure that we can get buy-in, with the executive authority being the champion of that roadshow. Minister Mondli Gungubele, Deputy Minister Pinky Kekana, and Deputy Minister Thembi Siwaya would be the champions who should be able to drive that roadshow, where we go to industry and say, this is what we've been doing as the MDDA for all these years. We are here to engage, to have a dialogue, to have an understanding from you what you think the MDDA should be and what it must stand for and what type of organization it must be in the future. In that way, we will be getting buy-in from the industry, we will be getting guidance from the industry, and we'll be getting commitment from the industry. So what the industry contributes in that roadshow should then be something that we put on the table and say, we've heard what the industry is saying. Are we aligned correctly as an organization to deal with the expectations from industry? In which way can we position ourselves to align in a way that gives value to the industry, so that in future when you ask them for money, they see good reason to give money. So we need to go and get the cue from the industry, because we were set up, or the MDDA was set up through an understanding that there's a partnership between print companies and the broadcast media. So perhaps there's a need to go and find another subtle mandate from those partners from those who were supposed to be partners at the inception of the MDDA. As it comes to Centec, I think Centec has its own running costs. Perhaps they charge what they believe is what is the value that they bring. I would be wary to go the route of saying it's too much or it's too low. Before we say, how can we reposition the MDDA for strength organizationally and financially? You know, maybe if the MDDA had funding from the industry, the cost of Centec would be an issue that it's not on the table for discussion. So I don't want to be overzealous and suggest there are costs issues with Centec. I don't even know how much are they charging. So I think a roundtable discussion with industry players and a deep understanding will help us work out the way forward in the future of how the MDDA must relate with Centec. I hope, Mekubega, that is sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Kubega, and thanks for the responses, Mr. Siecho. I just want to come back to this point because I think the questions raised by Honorable Kubega are based on what you would have raised earlier, that the issue may not be the legislation, which we may agree with you, looking at the time it will take to amend the legislation, and there's some work that needs to be done now. So I want to just come back to this point, that the initial roadshows done by the late Minister Tembo led to a situation where the MDDA came with what Honorable Kubega referred to as a model, a sustainability funding model. I think the point will really be that using the benefit of the research that you would have done, traversing the country and interacting with the industry, what's your assessment of this sustainability funding model? Of course, as I said, understanding that your way of looking at things is not to throw legislation review, but work more on the part of getting industry on board. So what's your assessment of the funding model, given the research that you may have come across, whether it's adequate to respond to this given the limitations of the current legislation, and if it has to be improved, what should be those areas? Over to you, Mr. Siecho.
Thank you, Honorable Maneli. You know, when it comes to legislation, I will continue to err on the side of caution. I think we have ample legislation in this country to achieve the things that we need to achieve in terms of the Constitution and in terms of other documents that govern what various political parties want to achieve for the country, including the Freedom Charter. I think what we need more than anything is a movement of the willing. And a movement of the willing is found through engaging and agreeing on what is it we are trying to achieve. I mean, you made reference to my research. When I realized that I was becoming a voice in the wilderness by making a lot of noise about how white the advertising industry is. And the more I said it's racist, the more I was deprived opportunities to pitch for big brands, and the more I was sidelined. And I said, I'm going to go out in the market and go and find out who this consumer is, who this human being is that buys products and how are they buying these products. And that is the kind of information that I gathered that made me a person of interest for advertising agencies. Even those that said I'm a rabble rouser, I'm a troublemaker, they were now willing to invite me to their boardrooms so that I can share with them my understanding of who this human being is, and who is this consumer, what languages do they speak? Is it true that they prefer to speak English more than they speak their language? Is it true that they are moving away from their cultures and traditions? You know, only when I could demonstrate to industry that these human beings are true to who they are. And if you want to communicate with them and reach them and sell more product to them, you need to speak to them in their languages, understanding their cultures. That's the only time when what I said became worth money. And companies were willing to pay to access this information and to appoint my agency to help them with marketing and advertising work. I hope I haven't gone through a roundabout way to explain that the MDDA must create its value positioning. And as soon as it gets that right, media agencies or the media industry will look to the MDDA to find the correct way of behavior as media industry in South Africa. And in that way, to fund the MDDA becomes an issue that is not worth debating, because institutions will fund the value that comes out of the MDDA, which means if you're not with the MDDA, you're not moving with the time, and the possibilities are you might be missing out on a lot of opportunities to build your own companies and to derive more value for your own company. So I think it's finding that relevance that we need to help the MDDA get to.
No, thank you, Mr. Siesho. Now, this is an opportunity for you in 2 minutes to speak to the committee once more before we close, having engaged thus far. I now hand over to you, your 2 minutes.
Thank you to the committee for the opportunity to be interviewed. I really appreciate the fact that you could look at my CV and believe that it is worthy of meeting me. And I'm really, really, really grateful. You know, the opportunity to speak about the SABC, for me, it was the greatest thing achieved here. So if I'm not appointed to serve on the board of the MDDA, I would be very, very, very fine with that, because my contribution to this industry is not dependent on where I serve. I serve my country wherever I have the opportunity. I'm actually writing my second book, and my second book will speak more deeper to the issues that I'm raising. So thank you. I'm very, very, very grateful to have honorable members listening to what I've said in this interview.
Thank you, Mr. Siacho. Of course, as we move towards closure now, just to deal with the formalities first, maybe to just indicate that for any further inquiries beyond this point, the support staff that was interacting with you, in particular, Mr. Ngoma, as you were preparing to come to this interview, you can direct those to him. I think with the way things operate, they are such that all our processes are transparent, much as the interviews we are having here today. The country is listening to the South African, indicating to the country what he believes needs to be looked at by those that are in the different areas of responsibility. As I said, from where we are, we think what I said earlier on could have been achieved by now, which is that of engaging with you, that we can learn some lessons that we can take beyond the interview as we continue to do our work of oversight over these entities as a committee. But also believe that through these questions that members would have raised in interacting with you, you'd also take something to reflect on and probably enrich the unfinished story in the book that you're putting up together, that you can also make such a reflection and contribute to the sector. So with that, we really want to thank you once again for making time. As I said, I know it's in the evening. Probably this would be time when you were relaxing, thinking about that chapter and that chapter. And we just opened a new one, that of interacting with the committee. Lord, thanks for making time. Mr. Ngoma will then assist us in relation to the next candidate, as Mr. Siacho would be getting off the platform. Thank you.
Yes, Chairperson, Professor Charlie, Professor Siasanga Charlie is on the platform, Chairperson. He is our next candidate. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ngoma, as we welcome Mr. Charlie. Did you say yes? No? I just see Charlie's in there. So I thought...
it's Professor Siasanga Charlie.
Yes, okay. Not Mr. Prof. Charlie. Okay. I just saw Charlie's so in the platform, Charlie SM. Okay, Prof, you are welcome. I'm trying to check if I am able to see you as we welcome you to this interview. Just to deal with the formalities, this is a subcommittee of the Committee on Communications in the National Assembly. So we report to the committee. So we are set up in terms of the National Assembly rules, which provides that the committee can set up the subcommittee to focus on a particular task, and the task at hand is that of filling vacancies as occurred in the MDDA board, of which you were nominated, and this committee would have shortlisted you to come before itself to be interviewed. So please feel welcomed. I know it's in the evening. You may have planned to do something else, but you also agreed to come before this committee to share some experiences as a South African. So we really appreciate that. Of course, I must say to you, it being the evening, also try and relax. It's just a conversation, Prof, that we are having with you, Prof. Charlie. And you will just relax and have that conversation. I think from it, members could learn a lot. And surely from interaction of the members, you would also take something beyond the interview itself. So I just thought I must start there so that when I introduce the members of the committee, you already feel welcomed by the committee itself. This committee is comprised of members drawn from political parties in Parliament, of course, taking into account the electoral support received by parties in Parliament. I will then introduce the members. After introducing the members, I will then also allow you 5 minutes to briefly introduce yourself, of course, speaking to your academic achievements, your experiences, and how that could contribute to the MDDA if you were to be considered by the committee. The 5 minutes is also informed by the fact that honorable members would have received your detailed CV well on time. They would have looked at that. And of course, in the engagements, they will engage on the basis of you having introduced yourself out of the CV, and that they can now link the CV to the person that is being engaged. So take it in that spirit, that the 5 minutes, of course, would not go through the detailed CV, but members would have read that. Yes. So without then a waste of time, as I said, please feel welcomed. I will then introduce quickly the members on the platform, starting with the African National Congress, the ANC. We have Honorable Kubeka. Honorable Kubeka.
Evening, Chair. Evening, Mr. Jali.
Evening, Honorable.
That's Honorable Kubeka. Then we have Honorable Faku. Honorable Faku.
Evening, Chair. Evening, Prof.
Evening, Honorable Faku.
Honorable Gumbo.
Evening, Chair, and the Prof.
Okay.
Evening,
thank you, Honorable Gumbo. Honorable Maneli, just to complete the ANC. I'm also the chair of this session. Of course, I'll now move to the Democratic Alliance Day. Honorable Mbele.
Thank you, Chairperson, and good evening to Prof. Jali.
Good evening. Thank you, Honorable Mbele. We do also have 2 other members who may not be with us, but I also want to give you the comfort that in terms of what is expected of us and the rules, we are a correcting number that is able to proceed with the interviews, and hence we have been proceeding in that line. We do have a member, Honorable Member Machozi from the IFP, who could not connect at this point. We also have a representative from the EFF, Honorable Bambo, who is also not with us at this point. But like I said, we have the numbers to continue with the interviews as scheduled. Once again, please feel welcomed, relax, and we now get to the conversation, starting with you introducing yourself in the 5 minutes, starting from now. And thereafter, I will then take each member for 5 minutes. And that 5 minutes would mean the question asked by the member, as well as your responses to the questions, will be in the 5 minutes per member. I would not really ask questions except in areas where I think we just need to get more from you to clarify a point. Over to you, Prof. Jale.
All right. Good evening, Chairperson, and good evening to the honorable members of the community. I'm Sia Sangachali. Currently, I am an associate professor at the University of South Africa, the Department of Communication Sciences. This is where I am also the chair of department. I've been a chair of department for the last 3 years. That is when I finished my first term. And then I'm embarking on my second term as the chair of department. In addition to that, in terms of leadership, something that speaks to leadership, I am also a council member and a deputy chairperson of the Film and Publication Board. In addition to that, in terms of the work experience, before I was an AP at UNISA, I've been a senior lecturer and junior lecturer at UNISA. And before that, I've played some research roles. And before that, I've also worked in the community media space, particularly community radio, as well as have assisted in research for community newspapers. The community radio station that I worked for is in the Eastern Cape, Forte Community Radio. In terms of qualifications, I have postgraduate qualifications. I have a PhD in media studies. I have a master's in media and cultural studies, as well as an honors and undergraduate bachelors from different universities, from Wits, from UKZN, and from Forte. I also have a number of short course certificates in leadership, in research, and yeah. So essentially, that is my background in terms of my professional experience, as well as my academic credentials. I've done a lot of research when it comes to the space of community media. You may have seen my CV. I've published extensively on the subject of community media, particularly community radio. My master's and my PhD were also on the subject matter. The master's was within the context of community radio and health communications, particularly looking at the aspects of participation by communities within the context of the messages that are distributed by these platforms. For the PhD, I also looked at community radio, looking at the aspects of decoloniality, Africanization, transformation of the messages, and culture within the context of the mediums themselves as well. So I'm saying this to sort of like give an idea in terms of the knowledge that I have, the experience that I have, and basically just to state that in terms of my experience, I've worked as a community radio broadcaster, as well as have done research within the context of community media. So I'd like to think of myself as someone who sort of like has the entire view of how the sector works, especially at policy, research level. And so with those few words, that is me, Chairperson. I think that you may have stated that in terms of how do my skills fit within the work of the MDDA, as I'm trying to demonstrate the fact that I'm experienced in research. And I think that research is something that comes across a lot within the work of the MDDA. Research is something that is enshrined within the mission statement of the MDDA. It cuts across quite a number of things because the work that the MDDA does is informed by research. And so I think that my research expertise, my professional standing as an academic, my experience in research, having conducted quite a number of, or maybe published quite a lot in terms of the community radio and generally the community media sector. So I think that that is what I am bringing to the table, so to speak, my professional standing as well as my qualifications. Thank you, Honorable Chairperson.
No, thank you, Prof. Charlie. I will now, as I said, having introduced yourself, as we continue the conversation, take the honorable members in the following order. We'll start with Honorable Faku, followed by Honorable Mbele, who would then be followed by Honorable Kungu. Then Honorable Kubeka would be last. I may come in just to get a point or two that would have been raised already by a member to clarify if the need arises. Otherwise, I just facilitate the discussions whilst I afford the opportunity for members to engage their questions. I now recognize then Honorable Faku to be the first to engage with you. Honorable Faku.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Good afternoon, Prof. How are you? Oh, sorry, good evening, Prof. How are you?
Good evening, Honorable Faku. I'm all right. I hope you're also well.
I'm well. So today I'm sitting on the other side of the desk and you are the student today. Oh, Prof, I was looking at your CV, very interesting. We're indeed grateful as this committee that we have so much young people that have interest in the sector. We're looking at your CV, your experience speaks for itself. So I would talk mostly what is on your CV. So I want us to have an engagement. I see the person that has nominated you says that you have combined experience and research in experience. So I want to touch on that. Can you tell us more about your research? Because the chair is saying that we as honorable members were here to learn as well. Your research when it comes to community media. Currently, we're funding this community media, but the business is not willing to advertise in these community medias. I don't know if your research has touched on that. Secondly, there's an issue of in these community radios. Most of them are not sustainable. What are the reasons for these community radio stations? You know, it's a complex and a competitive market that sometimes it leaves these radio stations in a worse condition than it was before. So I want you to tell us more about the research that you have done. I'm more interested in that. And what do you think should, maybe what should government do in terms of giving MDDA more resources, or do you think there are other options to get funding to assist the MDDA? So basically, my interest is there now. I've listened to the technical issues, but we don't have money. National Treasury has been bailing out these entities for quite some time. We want these entities to be sustainable. We want to get that experience because, as you know, we've been doing this interview since the beginning of the year. You have others. We are looking now, research, and MDDA has not been reaching its target when it comes to research due to the issue of constraints of budget. Can you tell us, maybe, institutions of higher learning can have partnerships with MDDA to assist with research? We want to hear more from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Faku. You are raising, good questions in terms of, first of all, my background and research that I've done when it comes to the sector. And I should state that upfront that the areas that I've looked at when it comes to the community radio sector, particularly is within the area of health communications. As I stated that there were concerns in the past around health communications. And it was in relation to the issue of messages of health, particularly it was in relation to HIV and AIDS messages, that they were being flighted without people getting any input in terms of those messages. And there was then an argument that those messages were not relevant because they lacked, local context, local views. And there was then an idea that if you've got community participation within the content in itself, then it might lead to behavioral change. And so I looked at that aspect, that is health communications, and looking at, the principles of community radio, one of which, there's quite a number of principles of community radio. But one of those is the element of participation. And I think that you would know that from the founding philosophies of community radio, the context of participation is something that has been emphasized. And so I did that research. I produced articles on it. I published articles on accredited journals, indeed affirming the understanding that when communities participate in these media platforms, then indeed the message becomes relevant. And secondly, I did my PhD within the context of community radio as well, and I've published about 2 book chapters at the moment. I've also just got an article that has been accepted for publication in an accredited journal as well. And there I really looked at quite a number of related concepts, but really they drive the issue of the transformation within the media space, and particularly the transformation that happens and facilitated by community radio content. And interestingly, I think that is something that touches on your question of sustainability. The case study that I looked at was Vugani Community Radio, which is based in the Eastern Cape, and I did a detailed analysis of the case study. And I can say without any shadow of doubt that that particular radio station seems to be sustainable. Of course, there will always be questions around sustainability and to which extent is one sustainable for a year, is one sustainable for 5 years, or how long is one sustainable? But I think that the measures that some sustainable radio stations have put in place is to expand. So you'd find that one radio station is engaged, for instance, in hiring, for instance, some of its equipment. Another radio station would branch into alternative forms of revenue generation, whether they would rent out a property, or they would engage in any other media activities that actually bring in some form of revenue. You also write that there is a challenge when it comes to the advertising space. And largely, I think that it has to do with perceptions. And the perceptions would be that it would be more beneficial to the business if one is advertising, within the context of the public broadcaster or the commercial media. And then you'd find that generally that perceptions means that the community media space is often looked down upon. And I think that really it's just issues of perceptions, as I'm saying, because at local levels, business at local levels have to look at those radio stations. Yes, you might find that at national or regional level, you might have businesses whose message then becomes regionally relevant. And that is when then the possibility of advertising at regional media, whether it is corporate media or the public broadcaster. So that is something that is correct, the one that you've noted, that the issues of advertising are a challenge to the sector. And it's something that we really need to look at. There is also an issue of where, in terms of, I think that the question that you've raised, that the government has been putting quite a lot of money within the sector, and we don't get to see much result of that. And I think you're correct. We have an instance where the MDDA particularly gets its funding from two sources. One would be the broadcasting space, and generally then would be the grant from the government. And I'm critiquing that outlook because in terms of the Act, it gives us quite a number of avenues where funding could be sourced. And one of the avenues that I think that has not really been explored is the issue of external or internal donor funding. You would recall that there's quite a number of donor funding that is possibly available, but donor funding needs to be linked to certain programs. So to go back to my example, if you have issues around health, particularly around this time where we've got vaccine hesitancy, and then you then source the funding from the donors, and then you link that up with community radio station, where then that funding could be used to enhance health communication in relation to issues of the vaccine and the messages that go into there. So I think there's quite a number of issues to be explored when it comes to funding. And I think that the Act in itself, it allows the entity to explore quite a number of those. Thank you, Honorable Fako.
Thank you, Honorable Fako. Honorable Mpele.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and good evening to you again, Professor Jali. I think my questions are going to be much along the same themes that have come up so far in the discussion. Let me just find my notes here quickly. So first, just as a broad generic question, is to ask from a perspective of what I've been calling strategic gap identification. What, from your analysis and observation, would you say is a key shortfall in the MDDA and its operating environments currently? To put it a simpler way, what would you change at the MDDA and why, if you had a sort of magic formula to make one sort of turnkey turnaround? And then secondly, given as you mentioned in your opening remarks and has been touched on so far, you're coming from a strongly research-based and academic-oriented background. Could you expand with some details, if you can, about your ideas and insights for how you would foresee your contribution to enhancing and enriching the research work of the MDDA itself in such a way that it would feed into strengthening its sustainability, as well as maybe enhancing and strengthening its unique role and position as a hub for community media development. So really how one would leverage the potential of research to feed into sustainability, the development and the up-leveling of community media going forward. Thanks, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honorable Mbele. I think that to start with your first question, in terms of the strategic gaps that I've identified, and how that links to my skills, I think that I should say firstly that my opinion is always that board member skills should be linked with the strategic planning and the strategic priority areas of any entity. So you basically should have board members who come from the finance space. You should have board members who come from the governance space. You should have board members who come from the research space, and so forth and so forth. And I think that for me, having looked at the MDDA, and one thing that I believe it is of strategic gap within that space, and looking at the reports that have come through from the MDDA, it is the issue of research. So you would have noted that in the 2019-2020 report, it is stated that, in fact, one of the weaknesses within the MDDA is around research. In terms of their commitments for the year, for the financial year, the areas where they did not deliver was in relation to research. There are about 2 or 3 research studies that they aimed to have info on, and they were not able to get into that. You also see in the report that there is no evidence that the research committee of the entity had said, particularly within the last quarter of that financial year. So I think that it is those are areas that are challenged when it comes to the entity, and I think that the skills that I have would actually meet that particular operational strategic area of the entity in itself. So I think that that is where I then become relevant in relation to the entity. And I think that you then raise a second question, which is quite similar, I think, to a question that was previously raised, or maybe it builds up on a question that was previously raised by Honorable Faku. And then you are then asking someone who is research-based in an academic or with an academic orientated background. And so if I can then just offer my insight, I think that I come from this space in the sense that I have quite an understanding of how higher education works, particularly in relation to research. At a spur of the moment, I can mention the top 3 or 4 universities and their academic departments that produce a lot of work when it comes to community media research. And so as someone then who has that background, as someone who understands the role of higher education in relation to the work of the MDDA, I feel that I can be potentially beneficial to the entity in striking those partnerships so that the weaknesses that have been identified within the entity in itself we can leverage on those with the partnerships. I hope I have tried to respond to your question, Honorable Mbele.
No, thank you, Honorable Mbele. I will now recognize Honorable Kumbu. You can start.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening to the Prof.
Good evening, Honorable Kumbu.
Yes. In your opening remarks, talk much about the new skills that you will bring to the MDDA, and if you can just elaborate further on this, I think you'll be in a better position too. The second one, Prof, if you are successful and be appointed to the board, how will you guide the agency in the fight against hate speech and this thing of fake news? Those are my two questions, if you can just respond.
Thank you, Honorable Kumbu. Just to make sure that I understand you correctly, your first question requires me to talk further about my skills. Am I correct?
You are.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. And so I then would have mentioned my research skills that I have, and I think that I've said quite a lot about that. But then in addition to that, I then would have mentioned my leadership skills. As I've stated that I oversee an academic department. And I think that is something that also speaks quite strongly to my leadership skills. I indicated that I would have spent the last 3 years of having a first term as a head of a department, and that is being renewed, and then I will then have another 3 years to contribute to actually this department. It's a department that also has done a lot of work on research, on policy, on media, because we are a Department of Communication Sciences, and media studies is something that we play a role on in relation to policy, in relation to quite a number of aspects. One of the aspects, it's something that you've mentioned, the hate speech and fake news, but it's something that I will come back just in a minute. I also have governance skills. I mentioned that currently I do sit on the Council of the Film and Publication Board, and I think that it is an entity that also reports to this committee. I'm also the chair, the deputy chairperson of that entity. So I think that it is something that also speaks to my, not only the governance sort of skills that I have, and experience that I have, but it's something that also speaks to my leadership skills as well, being a deputy chairperson of an entity. To then go back to your second question, Honorable Kumbu, which is how I will then guide the agency into looking at issues of hate speech and issues of fake news. I think that there is an ongoing acknowledgement that the MDDA should play a role in upskilling the journalists and other media practitioners that are working within the space of what you call the radio stations and the community television stations and the small commercial platforms that they fund. So there is then a need to make sure that we continuously upskill the media practitioners that work within those spaces. But there's also a need to make sure that the MDDA partners up with relevant industry bodies that actually do this work. In terms of fake news, one would look at relevant bodies such as Africa Check, for instance. Africa Check does a whole lot of work when it comes to fake news. And I think that another relevant industry, sort of like an institution that does work on this is AMM, Africa Media Monitoring Africa. Media Monitoring Africa, my apologies. So that is the sort of like guidance that I would offer to the entity, that the entity needs to partner up with relevant bodies that actually look at this, so that we are shielded from participating in these issues of hate speech as well as fake news. Thank you, Honorable Kumbu. I hope I have responded to your question.
Thank you, Honorable Kumbu. I now recognize Honorable Kubeka.
Thank you, Chair. Mine will have just few questions to Prof, because when you were going through the CV of Prof, it speaks for itself. But what I would like to know, Prof, do you think that the community media can compete with the public broadcaster or the commercial media? If yes or no, give us practical solutions that the agency can implement. And also, I would like just to know on the issue of the policies and the regulation and legislation of MDDA. Do you think is still relevant for MDDA at this present moment? And can I just ask, because I've heard you said you are having other commitments that you are at least working on, just like the Council of FPB and also a deputy chair. On the other side, you are there in UNISA. So if we can also appoint you here, can I just understand, is there any side where it's gonna be maybe not being balanced in order to play your role in all these positions, or how many positions that you understand that you can take it up and trying to balance in all those positions that you are in? And also, lastly, can I just understand on the side of the pandemic that we are, has only caused the significant challenges for health system all over the global and also here in South Africa, and has impacted on the economy and the livelihood of our people. As a board member, what do you think MDDA can do in order to respond to this health crisis that we are in? Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Honorable Kubeka. And so your first question then is my opinion as to whether the community media space can compete with the public broadcaster or the commercial space. And I should respond by this way. I think that there is value in the community media space collaborating instead of competing with the public broadcasting space as well as the commercial space. And I'm saying that because community media in this country arose out of particular circumstances, and there's quite a lot of policy debates that date back to 1990, 1992. The Jabulani Freedom of the Airwaves conferences that took place in order to actually justify the existence of the community media space. But I also think that the MDDA is quite clear on the role that should be played by the community media space. And that is supplemented by the Broadcasting Act, the 1999 Broadcasting Act, which also gives a distinction between what should we call a community broadcaster, a commercial broadcaster, and a public broadcaster. So taking that into consideration, my opinion is that no, I don't think that they should be competing, but there is value of the three, whether you're talking about community radio or a public broadcaster, there is value in actually approaching advertisers and approaching them aggressively. I don't think that it's something that I would personally view as competition, because everyone has their space and everyone is actually protected when it comes to legislation. And I think that your second point then comes to the issue of the policies, and whether do I think the policies that allows the existence of the entity is relevant. And I think that you would recall that the Act in itself was enacted around 2002. The MDDA Act is from 2002, and I think that between 2002 and now, it's close to about 20 years. And looking at the aggressive manner in which the industry changes, and looking at what has happened within the last 2 years, in terms of making sure that the industry is available within digital platforms and so forth, I would argue that there is value in actually relooking the Act in itself, and looking at the relevance of the Act, and where necessary, making sure that the Act becomes relevant within the context of the operations of community media 20 years, almost 20 years later, since it was brought into play. So my response when it comes to that, I would say, yes, I do think that the Act could be revisited, Honorable Kubeka. Then you have a question in terms of the roles that I play, and whether if it would be possible to add to those. I think that you would understand that in the context of academia, academics have about 4 KPIs. And one of those key performance areas would be the issue of academic citizenships. And academic citizenship actually requires, and it mandates us to actually play the role of having presence within the context of both. And so in relation then to the question itself, I would say that I am actually required to play these roles. It's something that forms part of my work, and in short, I would then say that yes, I should be able to actually play more of these roles. And then I think that your last question speaks to the role that should be played by the MDDA in reference to the pandemic. I think that first of all, I think that the MDDA has done quite a good job. It funded about, the first tranche was 10 million, then there was another tranche of 10 million. It facilitated, I think, interviews with the late minister in the presidency. What I would have liked to see more is more aggressive community media communication around the pandemic in itself, so that we just eliminate any possibility of a vaccine hesitancy. But I think that it is something that could still be addressed in relation to the entity. Thank you, Honorable Kubek. I hope I have tried to respond to your questions.
No, thank you, Honorable Kubeka. I think as we get to wrap up, I just want to combine what you've raised with regard to research, which was Honorable Faku's questions, as well as what Honorable Kubeka would have raised in relation to legislation. Just on a practical basis, one was trying to think about the environment side of the specific research you referred to, Fukani.
Yes.
And the collapse mainly in community media is in the so-called rural spaces or depressed towns, so to say. And you are saying that there's a sense of sustainability that comes out of that research. So I just want to check with you then that from the findings made there, what would you then recommend now in general, not just from Fugadi's side of things, from the point of the sustainability funding model that the MDDA would have put up after looking at the industry? So I'm just saying, I'm bringing that Fugani story purely from a point of the environment in which it is located and looking at those that also compete in the same space, whether regionally or whatever, but it doesn't change the environment itself from a town depressed and the surrounding villages that may be tapping from the same frequency. So I'm asking the question in that sense, so that you speak to the sustainability model that MDDA would have looked at, what could be lessons learned from those findings, and maybe take those recommendations forward 20 years almost down the line in terms of the legislative framework. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Chairperson, Honorable Chairperson. I think that let's look at it this way, Chairperson. So you find that there are community radio stations who work within the context of urban spaces. And then there are community radio stations who work within the context of quite rural spaces. And I think that when we look at the context of the sustainability model, it then makes a finding that we seem to have a higher failure rate at the stations that operate within the context of rural spaces. And I think that looking at two particular stations that seem to be doing quite well, one is the one that I specifically did my research on, and it was a case study research, Chairperson. So it becomes then quite difficult to sort of like do a cross or comparative analysis with other stations. But looking at the two that seem to be doing quite well, in my opinion, within the context of rural spaces, that is Vukani and Forte Community Radio. I would say that factoring in the aspects of the sustainability model, I would say that how we support those stations, we support them by going back to some of the things that we had started doing. So for instance, the model mentions the 30% that was committed, 30% in terms of advertising spend that was committed by the GCIS. But what you then find is that there is no regulation. So the 30% is not regulated. And so you'd find that it was then just a pronouncement that different departments would dedicate their advertising spend to the community media sector. And so you'd find that in order then for us to be able to aggressively support the space in terms of sustainability, that is one area to look at. Another area that we need to look at, it's mentioned quite a lot within the context of the sustainability model, community media and particularly community radio stations also need to be supported when it comes to issues of generating revenue that comes from the advertising space. And I think that one aspect that we have not looked at is actually making sure that these platforms, they generate from local businesses, not look at your ShopRites, which would then put their advertising within the spaces of the public or the commercial media. So that is another thing that we need to look at. But I think that there could also be other collaborations that could come into the space. And I mentioned previously the issue of donor funding. There is a lot of money that often comes to the space of community media if one looks at international debates around this, and it often comes from the donor funding such as your USAID, your Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundations, and all of this donor fund, it is often used to actually support the work of these community media platforms. And so I think that it's issues then that speak to the sustainability model and how we could better actually support the community media sector. Thank you, Chairperson.
As I said, we'll then also afford you an opportunity, having engaged us for 2 minutes for you to say something on your side before we close the session.
Thank you, Chairperson, for the opportunity again. I think that from my side, I would first of all like to thank the committee for the opportunity to come and actually speak about my ideas and what I think could be used to actually support the industry or the sector in itself. I think that having looked at my CV, I accumulatively, I would have about 13 years of experience, both as a researcher and as a practitioner within the space in itself. So I think that it's something that demonstrates my commitment to the sector and how I am actually supporting the sector through my scholarship and other research work that I do. So I would like to put it quite clearly that I have, just commitment to the work of community media, what it stands for, issues of freedom of expression, issues of participatory democracy, issues of making sure that the languages that are underserved by certain media spaces are actually served by those. So in short, I want to say that I'm actually committed to the work that community media represents, and I'm actually committed to the work that the MDDA does. So in short, that is my story, Chairperson.
Thank you, Prof. Kyali.
Thank you.
I would now wrap up by just dealing with the formalities first. That for administrative inquiries, of course, Mr. Ngoma, who has been assisting you in the preparations for coming before the committee for the interviews, who has been interacting with you, you can, of course, make inquiries with him in relation to the process we're engaged in administratively. Otherwise, as you know, our processes are quite transparent, that South Africans are able to also follow the discussions we are having. And they do also see South Africans who come before the committee to share with the committee on what is to be done to better serve the people, like we have done in this interaction with you. And I take it then that what we said earlier on has been achieved, in that after the interaction, surely the members would have also learned a lot from that engagement. And I take it that yourself, as you go back to other tasks, you would find time to make a reflection on what you could have learned from the interaction with the members. I think for us, more importantly, is that beyond the interviews, this committee still has a responsibility of playing oversight on the entities that report to the committee. And we take lessons that we draw from different South Africans who come before us, whether as candidates or want to just engage with the committee. We value those inputs and use that as we do our oversight work. It can only enhance the work that we do. So I'm just saying, if one was to ask that question, whether that point has been achieved, I can say it with confidence that indeed we had a conversation, and from this conversation we would have drawn lessons in that score. So that takes us then to the end of the interview, and from this point, Mr. Ngoma will then assist us to get the next candidate on the line as we are engaging candidates. As you are leaving, once again, continue to have the night to yourself. This is still young.
Thank you, Chairperson, and cheers.
Thank you.
Chairperson, the next candidate is Mr. Raylan Fisher. As you can see on the screen, he is on the platform already. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ngoma, as we welcome Mr. Raylan Fisher. So, Mr. Fisher, this is the subcommittee. I hope I'm addressing you properly. This is the subcommittee of the Portfolio Committee on Communications, set up by the committee to focus on the task of ensuring that the vacancies that have occurred at the MDDA board are filled. So this is provided for in our National Assembly rules, that a committee can set up a subcommittee to deal with a particular task. So as I said, that's the task we have. Of course, having been duly nominated, the committee has shortlisted, and that's why you are before this subcommittee on another phase of the appointment process, which is the interviews. As I welcome you on behalf of the subcommittee, I would want you to indeed relax, and I know it's that time of the day, the evening. So as we are on the evening side, I can guarantee you that we'll give you the attention, like all other candidates would have received the attention of the committee. All we can ask you to do is to really relax and just share your experiences with the committee and engage as such. So we take this as a conversation, really, more than just the word interview, in a way that through this engagement, as committee members, we can draw lessons from what you'd share with us. And we also think that as honorable members will be asking questions, you will also be able to draw lessons even beyond this interview. So as we continue with the conversation, it will be about that. So I'm really making sure that you're comfortable, you are relaxed, and just use the time to engage freely with the members. Just on the formality side, of course, this committee is constituted by members from different political parties, represented in Parliament, of course, taking into account the electoral support received by political parties. So as I introduce members, I will then go to them in terms of the parties. Of course, starting with the African National Congress, the ANC. After I've introduced the members, we will then give you an opportunity for 5 minutes to really introduce yourself briefly, looking at both your experiences, your academic development that you've undergone, and how that would assist the MDDA board if you were to be considered for recommendation by the committee. Then after that 5 minutes, we'll then get to members who will then engage with you. And that engagement will be 5 minutes per member. In that 5 minutes, it will take into account both the questions as well as your responses within that period. And then move to the next member for engagement. With that having been cleared, then I'll quickly go to the introduction. As I said, I'll start with the African National Congress, the ANC. We have Honorable Kubeka. Honorable Kubeka.
Evening, Mr. Ryland. Evening, Chair.
Evening, Honorable Kubeka, thank you. Honorable Faku.
Good evening, Mr. Fisher.
Good evening.
Honorable Faku, thank you. Now, Honorable Kumbu.
Good evening, Mr. Fisher. Good evening.
That's Honorable Kumbu, and then myself, Honorable Maneli, who's also chair of the session, just to complete the ANC. I will now get to the Democratic Alliance, Honorable Mbele.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good evening, Mr. Fisher.
Good evening.
Yes, we also do have representation from the IFP. Honorable Majozu could not make it, as well as the EFF representative, Honorable Pambo, who is also not on the platform. However, I would want to assure you that in terms of our rules, we have the adequate numbers to continue with the interviews, hence we have been able to continue with the interviews. So you can engage members with confidence that we are engaged in a properly constituted subcommittee process, given the number of members participating in this subcommittee. So that would really conclude the brief introduction of members so that you can relate to them as they will be engaging with you. And the time is now for you for the 5 minutes to your brief introduction. As I say, that reflects on your experiences and your academic development. It's 5 minutes because members would have also had an opportunity of going through your detailed CV. Of course, in the engagement, that would take both your brief introduction as well as what they would have gone through when they interact with you. And the time is for you now. May I hand over to you, Mr. Fisher, to address the committee. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to engage with the committee. My background is media. I've been in the media industry for more than 40 years. I've occupied all kinds of senior positions within the media space. But one of the reasons why I feel I would be able to make a contribution to the MDDA is based on my earlier years in the media. I started out at what was called the Argus Company, at a paper called the Cape Herald, which was a paper that was supposed to cater for people who I suppose look like me and sound like me. Because in those days, this was 1980, people who looked like me and sounds like me couldn't really get work on the what was then called the mainstream newspapers. And the irony of it is that probably about 15 years later, I ended up becoming the editor of one of the mainstream newspapers. But after a few years at the Cape Herald, and I was also
Recording
involved.
in progress.
I was also involved at that time in youth organization. I was a leader of the Cape Youth Congress, on the first executive of the Cape Youth Congress. And I was a journalist during the day and activist at night, basically, involved at the time of the formation of the UDF and involved in various organizations in Cape Town. And even when I was working at the Cape Herald, I was working with a paper called Grassroots Community Newspaper. So I would leave the Cape Herald offices at 5 o'clock and then go straight to the Grassroots office and leave there at like 11 o'clock at night. And Grassroots was one of the original community papers and influenced a lot of other community papers. So there was Saamstaan in Oudtshoorn. There was a paper in Namibia called BRICS. There was Speak, which I think was in Joburg. There was another paper in, and I've forgotten, this was so many, many years ago, but there were all these newspapers that we were involved in. And I still say to this day that I learned most of my management skills at Grassroots because we were democracy at Grassroots. We really took democracy to different levels. Every story we wrote was consulted. Everything we did was done in collaboration with community organizations, youth organizations, church organizations, sports organizations. And so I learned a lot about kind of just dealing with people through that kind of interaction at Grassroots. And I still apply some of those lessons that I learned then in my dealings with people today. Towards the end of the 80s, and as you all know, the 80s was a very difficult period for all of us in South Africa. Some of us got detained. Some people were killed. We went through states of emergency. But towards the end of the 1980s, I could see that the media environment was going to change, and that the the established media groups were going to look for senior journalists, to appoint to senior positions in these groups. And at that time, I got approached by the Sunday Times, and I worked in the Sunday Times Cape Town office. Then they moved me to Durban to head up the Durban bureau, and then they moved me to Johannesburg, where I became an assistant editor of the Sunday Times. And then while I was assistant editor of the Sunday Times, I then got offered the deputy editor of the Cape Times with almost a promise that I would become editor within a year, which is what happened. And since I left the Cape Times, and it's like 20 years ago already, I've done all kinds of things. I've dabbled a little bit in business. We ran a very successful project called One City Many Cultures, which is still, part of it is still existing today. And at some point, I headed up the School of Journalism at what was then known as Peninsula Technikon. At some point, I worked with one of the ministers in Parliament. I worked with Sekunjalo also at some point. So I've done a whole lot of different things. And I think all of those kind of things have helped me to become a better person and a more rounded person, understanding not only journalism, but also understanding business and also growing my understanding of society. I've written a couple of books. One of the books is called Race, which deals with the issue of race and racism in post-apartheid South Africa. And that book did very well. And I've written 3 other books since then. And at some point, I also tried to start a community newspaper using my own money and 3 friends. And we started a little paper called Rakenstein Express in Paarl. We survived for about 18 months. But I realized that the problem was that I should have lived in Paarl. I should have gone to live in Paarl to steer the paper properly. I went to Paarl every week, but that wasn't enough oversight. And the paper eventually died. And I lost a lot of money in that process. But I think it was money that, it wasn't money that I felt bad about losing, because I think it kind of helped to create some kind of a buzz in the community. So yeah, I've done a lot of things in my life, and I've done, I think I would bring all of those kind of experiences to bear, including my love for community papers and community media, which is something that is quite very dear to me.
Well, thank you, Mr. Fisher. As I said, I will then afford honorable members to engage with you in the 5 minutes allocated per member for question and your responses. I will start in the following order. It will be Honorable Faku first, followed by Honorable Mbele, and Honorable Gumbu, and I will then take Honorable Kubeka as the last. Of course, I will only come in if I need to emphasize a point that may have been covered by members that needs clarity. Honorable Faku, you are now recognized. You can proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Good afternoon, Mr. Fisher. Thank you for your opening remarks. Quite interesting when one looks at your CV, the experience, the community work that you have offered for our country and for the many things that you have done. When I was looking at your CV, you touched on the issue that made me very much interesting about the grassroots, that you turn into a community newspaper. You know, currently in rural areas, there are no libraries in community. If you go to Ndabankulu, you go to Lusiki City, you will never find libraries. And I think that the community radio is supposed to play a vital role in educating children about indigenous languages, of what our government is doing, about everything around them. But when you come to metros, you come to bigger cities, those opportunities are there. So I want, especially with your experience and your background, I think there's a paper or a book that you wrote, which is The Voice, that when people could not share what they wanted to share, you developed that paper. So this is what is lacking currently when you look in these community radios. If given an opportunity, you form part of the MDDA board, can you tell us more? How would you try and make sure that a young child that is in a rural area has access to this information? For one, I have been saying in the committee that there's Vukuzenzele newspaper. I used to read that paper when I was still in school. Now that I'm older, I have this argument. I don't see that paper anymore, not because I have a better status or what, but I don't see that paper, but I'm told that that paper is still in rural areas. So I want you to tell us more. What do you think should be done? You've been in the sector for quite some time, and you know that transformation is not where we want to see it currently. With your background, what do you think should be done? And currently, our government is currently assisting these community radio stations through MDDA in funding them, but majority of them are not sustainable. What is the problem? Is it content? What are the challenges? Perhaps you would know better because you've been there, you've been in the sector. And lastly, the funding model that we're using as government to give, you know, currently we're in the fourth industrial revolution. Is what we are giving our community radio stations enough? I know there's an issue of budget. In terms of the funding model, do you think that you should only rely on government, or can you look at other options in terms of getting funding? But I must say that your CV is very interesting. I would listen to other honorable members. Thank you very much for coming today. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So thank you for your questions. They're very interesting questions, and they're the kind of questions where there's no easy answer. So there are a couple of things at play here. The one is that the media industry is driven by advertising. The advertising industry is driven by this very false notion that people with money will buy products. And therefore, you must aim your media at people with money, and you must ignore people without money and people without resources. And that is something that I've tried, even when I was at the Cape Times, I tried to change that, to say that we need to report on people, we need to report on our communities, we need to make sure that our community's voices are heard, even when those communities are perceived not to have money. Because those people are also important in terms of the makeup of a country. The majority of people in South Africa are poor. And so are we saying that we are going to listen to the advertising industry and ignore the majority of South Africans because they don't have money? So that's the one thing. So the other thing that I feel with the media industry, and this is at mainstream media also, the media in this country have not really been able to understand our society properly. And they haven't done enough to understand our society. They haven't done enough of going onto the ground and speaking to people and providing voices for what some people call ordinary people. I don't like the term ordinary people because then there's an assumption that they are also extraordinary people. And I like to just talk about people. But so because the media doesn't understand our society, they're not able to report on our society properly, that means that people will not consume the media in the numbers that you want them to consume it, because the media doesn't speak the language that people know, and they don't tell the stories of people. So that's the second thing. The third thing that I've realized about the media in the past, and especially in the past couple of years, when we've had this transition from almost old-fashioned print and stuff, and old-fashioned broadcast in a way, to more digital kind of content and stuff like that. What I've realized is that content is king, okay? You must get your content right before you can even think about getting any support from anybody. If you don't have proper content, you will never ever be able to appeal or to make your product appeal to anybody. So we need to focus on content all the time. Work with young people, get them to tell their stories, get them to tell the stories of older people, and really just focus on content all the time. So that, for me, that's important. In terms of funding, I really feel that this model in which the MDDA was set up, it's a good model. I was around at the time when all of these things were happening. I was one of the leaders of the South African National Editors Forum at the time. But I think there is scope to look outside of government and the main established media organizations, to look at how can we entice more corporate support into the sector. Because it's important for the corporates who make their money off poor people to also give back to those poor people who need to have a voice. And so that is part of what I would really try to do, is to find ways of enticing more corporates to put their money where their mouth is, in a way, and to support the sector a lot more.
Yes, thank you, Honorable Faku. We will now go to Honorable Mpele. Honorable Mpele, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairperson, and good evening again to you, Mr. Fisher. Let me just find my notes here. Okay, so both from your opening remarks and also in looking at your extensive CV, it's quite evident that you have a vast wealth of journalistic and editorial experience. So that's the kind of substantive value add I think you would have to forefront. How, as my first question, would you foresee that set of skills, networks, and insights feeding into the work of the MDDA from the governance and board level, especially plugging into their drive to strengthen their sustainability, and that's of the community media landscape in general. And then secondly, you had mentioned also in your opening remarks having been involved in founding and running a community newspaper, which I think is actually quite unique in a number of the candidates we've looked at. So I'm curious to hear what lessons would you share from that practical experience to promote community media development and sustainability. It's an ongoing theme for us in the portfolio committee, and just framing that in terms of both shortcomings, opportunities that exist in the landscape. Thanks, Chairperson.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think in some ways I might have answered a little bit of your question with my previous answer, but I will say again, I mean, for me, everything revolves around content. And so you need to sort out your content before you can actually go out to people and ask people for support. And I do have a lot of experience outside of editorial in business. I have a huge network in business, and I will find ways of using that network to, like I said earlier, to appeal to business, to also put them out, the money where their mouth is in terms of supporting the sector, which I think can be quite an important sector for business. So in terms of the paper that I started, the Drakenstein Express, like I said at the beginning, I learned a lot from my experience at grassroots. And when we started the Drakenstein Express, I wanted to start a paper that would almost be a modern version of grassroots. So I did some of the things similar to what we did at grassroots, and some things we did differently. So the one thing we did, for instance, when we decided we were going to launch this paper, we called a meeting at the Taal Monument, at the Taal Museum in Paarl. And we had about 150 people there from all kinds of organizations in the community. And we told them that we are launching this paper to serve you and to give you a voice. And we want you to tell us what our content should be. We want you to give us tips when you hear of things happening in the community. We want you to work with us in terms of, making sure that we cover all the sports, that we have proper religious coverage, that we have proper community coverage, that we have articles that appeal to young people. The one auntie at the meeting said, I can give you recipes, and she did. And so that was the first thing for us, to make sure that the paper was accepted by the community, and that the community almost felt like the paper was their idea. Even though we came to them with this idea, they got very excited, and they were, talking about all the things that we could do with this paper. And one of the things that we did, we went to big companies that were operating in the Paarl area, and we made them a proposition. We said to them, please support us for a year, okay, with advertising. And in return, you will get your marketing exposure, because we will print 5,000 or 10,000 copies every month. So you will see your ads in the paper. But on top of that, because you're supporting us for a year, we will give you 1% of shareholding. But now we know you're a big corporate. You don't want 1% of shareholding. But what we will do is we will take that 1% of shareholding and we will give it to a community organization on your behalf. And so in return for getting the marketing exposure, you also then get the BE brownie points because you're not doing corporate social responsibility. And some of the corporates, in fact, liked it and supported us on that basis. And I really believe that that's the kind of a model that one could build on. You know, whether it's community radio or television or print, but it is something that we need to look at. We need to look at different and innovative kind of ideas to get people excited about community media and to get people to put their money behind community media. So those are the kind of the lessons. And I think the involvement of the community is so crucial. I mean, one of the things that we did at Grassroots was Grassroots, you know, we had youth and civic members involved in everything. News gathering. Our news gathering meetings, we had 50 people in the meeting, sitting in a circle. And we would go around the circle and would ask people to tell us what's happening in the community. And that's how we kind of compiled our news diary. We, even in the production of the paper, there was myself and a guy called Mike Norton, who were the only two journalists who were trained. And then we worked with young people and we trained them how to edit. We trained them how to write. We trained them how to do layout. And we trained them how to take pictures. Even when we printed the paper, the young people came with us and they helped to fold the papers at the printers. And then we would go out and we would sell the paper as a collective. And so we would send 300 people into Elsies River. And the people would come from all over. We would have people from Langa, Guguletu, from Mitchellsplein, from Menenberg, from Observatory, from Highlands. And we would all go into Elsies River on a Saturday morning to go sell Grassroots. And that's how and so those are the kinds of things also that somehow we need to bring back. You know, get people excited, engage with the community, and not just kind of be something that reports on the community, but you must engage with the community and let the community take ownership of your media.
Yeah,
Sorry, I can talk a lot.
Thank you, Honorable Mbele. I now recognize Honorable Kumbu. Honorable Kumbu.
Thank you, Chair. And good evening, Mr. Fisher.
Good evening, sir.
Mr. Fisher, no, I'm quite impressed by your CV. It shows that you are quite experienced in this field. But given the fact that at some stage you were a political activist and you had been in the media space for quite a long time. Now, what is your understanding of the media freedom in South Africa? That will be my first question. Secondly, what could be the role of the MDDA in promoting community media in a digital environment? Those are my two questions. If you can just respond to those questions, I'll be listening.
Okay, I think, you know, at some point I also chaired the Media Freedom Committee at SANEF. It was a very difficult time. I've always believed that media freedom is something that should not be the concern of the media only. It is something that the entire community should be taking ownership of. And so you will always hear me talk about community taking ownership, because I really believe that the biggest protection for the media against any attacks on media freedom would come from those media organizations being rooted in the community, so that when the media is under attack, the community would stand up for those media, because those media stood up for the community when the community needed them. And those media would be, in a way, owned by the community, even if it's owned by private companies. But ownership in terms of involvement and feeling that you belong. Okay, and so for me, that's how I feel about media freedom in South Africa, and we are very far from that. And so media freedom is almost like a foreign concept to many people out there, because it belongs to journalists. It doesn't belong to us. And so I would want to change that. Community media in a digital environment, I really feel, and I will go back to this time after time, content, okay? If you have proper content, then you can decide how to use it, whether you want to, and I must say to you, no more than 20 years ago, when I was at the Cape Times, I took my staff and I said to my staff, the journalist of the future is going to be somebody who will go out with a video camera to go do an interview. He or she will shoot an interview with a video camera, come back to the office, take a video clip and make a little piece for television, take an audio clip and make a little piece for radio, write a little story that will be printed in the publication, take all of that stuff and put it on the internet. More than 20 years ago, probably 22 years ago, I said that at the Cape Times, and everybody looked at me and they thought I was crazy. And that is precisely what's happening nowadays. Where journalists are going out and they have to be multi-skilled. You no longer get a journalist who just writes, or, you get a journalist, they write, but they also take audio, they also take video, and they produce, multiple pieces. And so that's the future of community media also. Even when I interview somebody, I record the interview. I sometimes do the interview with a video camera. And in fact, I've done a couple of interviews where I've had 2 iPhones, and I put up the 2 iPhones, and then I kind of take the audio, the video, and I post it on YouTube, and you will see that I've done a couple of interviews with people like Njongonkulu Ndungani, Ibrahim Rasool, Tuli Madonsela, Baleka Mbeti, Jonathan Jensen, people like that I've interviewed, and I've put the interviews on YouTube, and I wrote pieces based on those interviews for the Week in August. And then I also cut little pieces out of it, and I used it to promote different things. And so that's how you have to do it. You have to be creative with the content. But the first thing is to find the content, is to identify what will be the content. And once you've done that, then you can start playing around. You can start playing with doing video, audio, and a whole range of other stuff. The community media will have to go digital more than print or more than even broadcast, because that's where the future is. And so it's always good to try to be one step ahead. And so that's also where I would kind of see the future of community media is eventually. I think, everybody predicted the demise of print. I think there is still some kind of a room for print if they do it properly. But I think the demise of print will come at some point. Maybe it will be in 5 years' time, maybe it will be in 10 years' time. I think community media will survive longer than mainstream media in terms of print. I think community media will probably also survive longer than, for instance, if you look at doing videos and stuff, it's become cheaper to do videos. It's become cheaper to do audio, and so there are more opportunities for community media in that space than there was in the past.
Thank you, Honorable Kumbu. I now recognize Honorable Kubeka. Honorable Kubeka, can you proceed?
Thank you, Chair. I will just ask some few questions to Mr. Fisher, because I can hear indeed the experience also is there. But what I would like to know, Mr. Fisher, maybe on the side of the MDDA, they've tried to work very well, and even if you can hear on the side of their results, on the side of the Auditor General, they've managed even to receive for 3 following successful years the issue of an audit report. But now they are also having a challenge on the side of the research. And indeed, they've managed also to make it that us must be aware on that side. So I want to know, if you can be appointed, how can you assist the MDDA on that side of the research? Because it seems as if that's where they are still having a challenge. The other one, Mr. Fisher, can you just demonstrate possible strategies and techniques that the MDDA can implement to increase the funding model for community media? Because if you can also check on that side, it's still a little bit a challenge, because MDDA is getting a limited resources, but also even if they are getting those limited resources, they try to work on those limited resources in order to push everything on their side. So how can you assist on the side of the MDDA in order that maybe they can see themselves being increasing on that side of the also of the funding model? The last question that I would just like to know, on the issue of the fake news, you can see that now fake news is more higher than, instead of giving the community what is happening in a true sense. How can also try to balance or to overcome that challenge of the fake news on the side of MDDA? I thank you.
Okay, so thank you for your questions, and I think we need a couple of hours of engagement. Yeah, the questions are quite deep. So in terms of research, I believe that the best journalism is based on proper research. And the research, you need to know your market. You need to know who you're writing for. And even before you start researching stories and so on. And so I can only hope that my experience of just speaking to people, I speak to people. I mean, my latest book is one where I just went across the province of the Western Cape, and I just spoke to people about the South Africa they want to live in. And so that's the kind of stuff that I believe in. Okay, it's just creating those kind of opportunities for people to tell us what they want and what they want to read, what they want to see, what they want to hear. And then we need to kind of use that to try to give them what they want. I have spoken a bit about increasing funding. I think I have demonstrated, for instance, the fact that you need to make businesses realize that it's important for them to support alternative media, because a lot of the people who they depend on to make their businesses grow actually support this media, and so it's in their interest also to support the media. So you need to find a compelling way of telling that story. I've always believed, and even when I've been involved in NGOs and so on, and I've always said that yes, we have an NGO, but we need to start treating this NGO like a business. Okay, and so when we go and we ask people for money, we must say to them, this is what we offer you in return. So we don't just go to them with a begging bowl. We go to them and we say to them, you know, like we did with Drakenstein Express. We went to the business people and we say to them, we will carry your advertising in, you know, we will print 10,000 copies per month. And so you will see your advertising, but we are also giving you something extra. And so those are the kind of things that we need to talk about, is how do we go to business people? How do we make business people feel that they're not just helping us, but we're also helping them. We're helping them get their message out to people who hear their message, who need to hear their message. The issue of fake news is something really, really difficult. And I've seen even seasoned journalists falling prey to spreading fake news. And so it's again, it comes down to your content. It comes to the mechanisms that you put in place to make sure that your content is properly vetted, to make sure that before you put out any piece of information, you know, it has gone through a few sets of eyes or ears in some cases. And that's the only way that you can actually protect your organization from putting out fake news. There's not much that one can do about social media because it is so easy. And I would like us to find a way in which we could not censor social media, but monitor it a bit more carefully and put some kind of measures in place to make sure that fake news cannot be spread as easily as it is spread at the moment. And I just don't know what the mechanism should be, but it is a conversation that we should be having. And I'm sure that even people in the mainstream media could support some kind of mechanisms that will be put in place to counter the spread of fake news.
Thank you.
Whenever I see your face coming up, Chairperson, then I know I need to stop talking.
It's just to indicate that you must really conclude. So at least you've led that quick. Of course, I also get to be careful of breaking the engagement, but it's important to just make sure we still manage the time, as we still have also other candidates to see without, as I say, compromising the quality of engagement. Just to get the point in a way that leads to the member that you're engaging. But like I said, I don't really ask the questions except to just come back to a point that you may have raised for better understanding. because every time your emphasis is on content, which must be compelling for any investor, any advertiser, and so on. And I think that's what also the mainstream would be challenged to, including the public broadcaster, the SABC. And the question therefore would be, do you then see sustainability as an issue of competition for this compelling content? Now in the context of your public broadcaster, your commercial, vis-a-vis the community media, which MDDA is responsible for. So do you see that sustainability from a point of competition? If that's the case, why? Or do you see it from a point of collaboration? And if so, why would you think sustainability would come out of that? We have 5 minutes to go through that. Thank you.
Okay, no, that's a very good question, and I really think that the mainstream media needs to realize that alternative media or community media can play a supportive role to the mainstream media, and so part of what community media often does is it can sometimes provide an entry point for people to sample media. People who might not have been interested in media, people who might not have been interested to read, people who might not have been interested to, listen to radio, watch television. Sometimes they would get enticed by community media, and then eventually they also kind of start consuming other media. And so from that perspective, it would be important for the mainstream media to help to assist the community media. And so I think, for instance, things like internships for people who are going to be working in community papers at bigger publications, so that they can also learn a little bit about how the big media works. That is also something that should be looked at. And then I think just generally the support. The other thing that I think that needs to happen, which I don't think happens enough in the community media space, is that there must be more collaboration between different media. And so, for instance, when you have big stories, you could have a team working on a big story, whether it's for print or for radio or television, and that team could do that big story for all community media or for different kind of community media throughout the country. Quite often you find that people work on stories and put their news bulletins and stuff together in isolation. I think there should be more of a collaborative effort on that and kind of producing the good content. Ultimately, the principles of running media houses is the same. And so the principle of reporting are the same. And so those principles could be applied and they could be used, kind of abroad or across different media forms. But I really believe that the future of community media lies in a collaboration between government, in whose interest it is to have a greater diversity of voices out there. The mainstream media, in whose interest it is to help develop more viewers, listeners, readers, through the community media and through business, in whose interest it is to make sure that they support the media that is supported by the people who support their businesses. And so ultimately, if you can find a good balance between getting those three to work together, and then of course, I mean, you know, throwing in the role of civil society, who can help to supply resources and also news towards the community media environment. If you do all of it, I think you can, in all of it, you can find some kind of solution to make sure that the community media remains sustainable.
Thank you.
But chairperson, is not going to be an overnight thing. It's going to be, there's a lot of work, and I know a lot of work has been done. But I'm a very simple person. I really believe just in doing the basics. If you do the basics right, then the rest can follow. I always tell my reporters, who always, you know, reporters sometimes want to break the rules. And I say to them, you first need to understand the rules. You first need to know how to apply the rules before you can break the rules. And so for me, the same would apply to community media. Understand the rules and then build on it. And then we see, you know, where it leads us.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Just as we are about to close, like I promised out, then still come back to you, having engaged this far. Still afford you 2 minutes to speak to the committee before we get to the formal closure of our interaction. Over to you.
Yeah, so I must say I was a bit hesitant. I was nominated, I think it was more than a year ago. And I was a bit hesitant about this interview, and I didn't quite know what to expect out of this interview. And I wasn't even sure whether I actually still would want to be on the MDDA board if I kind of got selected. But just engaging with the committee tonight, for me it was quite an interesting experience and quite an inspirational experience for me to start thinking again in a very kind of active way around the problems of community media and how they can be addressed. And I know that based on my experience of community media many years ago and fairly recently, and based on my experience in the media industry and based on my network, I will be able to play a positive role if the committee feels that I'm the person who should be appointed to the board. And I really believe that I can do that. But I also have confidence in the committee to make the correct decision. And if the committee feels that I'm not the person to do that, that is fine. I've always been driven by a desire to serve my country. It drives my wife mad sometimes when I do things. And then she says to me, but how are you getting paid? And I say, don't worry about pay. Pay will sort itself out. I need to do this because it is necessary for me to do this. And so that's how I feel about community media also. I'm very passionate about community media. I'm really passionate about South Africans telling their own stories and Africans telling their own stories. And the community media provides a beautiful platform for us to begin telling our stories as South Africans. So thank you, Chairperson, and thank you, committee members.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Fisher. As I said, we've come to the end of the engagement we've had. Of course, I'll just deal firstly with the formalities that for any administrative inquiries, Mr. Ngoma would be available to do that, as he has done in working with you to get to where we are today.
Yeah.
But I think from the side of the committee, I can just add that, as you know, our processes are quite transparent. All the stages get to be seen by South Africans. And in that score, you would know where the committee is. I'm saying besides the formalities of informing people, but they can follow what happens in the committee. And I think that's a good thing in terms of the democratic government that we have, that we can enforce accountability in every step of the way. But I think what's also important is really to come back to the point that we raised earlier on, that we take this as a conversation and that we would learn from you as members, which are lessons that go beyond the interview itself, because we continue beyond the interview to do oversight work in these entities like the MDDA. And that South Africans share with us in every interaction that they make with the committee. We use that to also enrich our understanding in a way that betters the way we need to approach matters before us as the committee. And I also assume that yourself, having engaged with members, as you've already expressed, that it did activate something in you, that the fountain of knowledge in the space that you have can still be tapped upon by South Africans, as you have shared the experiences today. And I take it that you will still be available to South Africans in the different platforms to continue engaging, because I think, like you said, every South African who really is patriotic would want to serve the country in any way possible. So I would want us to close from that point, that it's a continuous engagement. Surely the few minutes that we had would not create enough space to engage other matters in detail, but we have a sense of such an engagement. We really thank you for that. Now, as we close, Mr. Ngoma will then assist us as you float from the platform, and that we can get to engage with the next candidate that will be directed by him. Well, once again, thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Chairperson, sincere apologies for not switching on my camera. ESCOM is not doing justice with me this side. I've been experiencing some power outages since 7 o'clock. I'm also worried that I might get cut off because both my gadgets are very low on power, because as I've indicated, this has been happening since 7 o'clock, but my candidate, my colleagues have provided them with information to assist with the last candidate after Ms. Mukubung. On the platform, Chair, we have Ms. Amandle Mukubung. She's the second last candidate for the evening. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ngoma. As we welcome Ms. Mukubung, I hope I'm pronouncing well. On behalf of the committee to deal with the formalities as I welcome you, that this is a subcommittee of the Committee on Communications, which is created by the committee in line with the National Assembly rules, which allow a committee to put up a subcommittee that focuses on a particular task. And the task of this committee is really to look at the filling of the vacancies that have occurred at the MDDA board, of which you were duly nominated, shortlisted, and that today would have an opportunity to interact with the committee. The committee is also constituted by honorable members drawn from political parties in parliament, of course, taking into account the electoral support received by parties.